Sometimes a mother's love can be the cruelest prison of all. For young Astrid, every day meant enduring her mother's harsh words and knowing she was seen as nothing more than something to be sold. Her mother had already promised her to the village's most brutal merchant in exchange for coin. When a mysterious stranger offered marriage, Astrid accepted without hesitation. She had no choice but to trust this unknown man with scars on his face and kindness in his eyes. What she didn't know was that her new husband was Erik Valgrimar, heir to one of the richest Viking clans in Norway. What would happen when her greedy mother discovered the daughter she threw away was now wealthier than royalty? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter wind carved through the gaps in the tavern's wooden walls like an unwelcome guest, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another harsh winter in Ravenshollow. Astrid pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she bent over the rough-hewn table, scrubbing away the remnants of ale and grease left by the evening's patrons. Her wooden prayer beads, worn smooth by years of desperate prayers, clicked softly against the table's edge with each movement, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The tavern stood silent now except for the occasional crack of settling timber and her mother's heavy footsteps pacing the floor above. Ingrid, Erik's daughter, had inherited the Raven's Rest from her late husband, along with a bitterness that seemed to grow deeper with each passing season. What had once been a woman capable of laughter and tenderness had hardened into something cold and calculating, viewing everything and everyone through the lens of what profit they might bring. Astrid paused in her scrubbing, allowing herself a moment to remember her father. Erik had been a gentleman, with calloused hands and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He used to tell her stories of distant lands and brave warriors, of women who chose their own destinies. Those memories felt like fragments of a dream now, fading more each day under the weight of her current reality. "Girl," her mother's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Stop your dawdling and finish those tables. We have paying customers in the morning, and I won't have them sitting in your filth." "Yes, mother," Astrid called back, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of shame. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. Better to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself. The village of Ravenshollow clung to the mountainside like a stubborn lichen, its handful of wooden buildings clustered around the narrow valley, where the Frost River cut its way toward the sea. Most of the men made their living fishing or trading, while the women tended small gardens and raised what livestock could survive the brutal winters. It was a hard life that bred hard people, and Astrid had never known anything else. She moved to the next table, her movements efficient from years of practice. The tavern served as the village's unofficial gathering place, where news was shared, deals were struck, and gossips exchanged their latest discoveries. Astrid had heard it all while serving ale and cleaning tables. Which fisherman's wife was with child, whose crops had failed, who owed money to whom? She had become invisible to the patrons, just another piece of furniture in her mother's establishment. The heavy wooden door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air that made the oil lamps flicker. Astrid looked up to see Helga, the baker's wife, hurrying inside with her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. "Astrid, child," Helga said, stamping the snow from her boots. "Is your mother about?" "I've news that might interest her." Before Astrid could respond, Ingrid's footsteps thundered down the wooden stairs. Her mother appeared in the doorway to the upper floor, her iron-grey hair pulled back severely and her pale eyes sharp with interest. At 42, Ingrid still possessed traces of the beauty that had once caught Erik's eye. But years of hardship and growing resentment had carved deep lines around her mouth and eyes. "Helga," Ingrid said, descending the rest of the stairs. "What brings you out in this weather?" Helga glanced meaningfully at Astrid, who immediately understood the signal. She busied herself with wiping down tables that were already clean, staying just close enough to overhear while appearing focused on her work. "It's about Bjorn Ironhand," Helga said in a lowered voice. He's been asking questions about your Astrid again. Thorvald says he's been inquiring about her age, her health, whether she's spoken for. Astrid's hands stilled on the cloth she was holding. Bjorn Ironhand was the village's most successful merchant, a man who had built his wealth through shrewd dealing and ruthless collection of debts. He was also known for his cruel treatment of those who crossed him and his particular interest in young women. At nearly 50, he had already buried 2 wives under circumstances that made the village women whisper and cross themselves. Has he now? Ingrid's voice held a note of calculation that made Astrid's stomach clench. And what else did Thorvald say? That Bjorn has silver to spend and is looking for a wife who can bear him sons. A young wife. Helga's voice dropped even lower. He mentioned that a dowry might not be necessary if the girl were willing, and her family cooperative. Astrid felt the blood drain from her face. She continued her mechanical wiping, but her heart had begun to race. Her mother's financial troubles were no secret in the village. The tavern barely earned enough to keep them fed and sheltered, and the roof needed repairs they couldn't afford. She had seen the way Ingrid counted and recounted their meager coins, the way she frowned over the ledger where she tracked their debts. Interesting, Ingrid said carefully. Astrid is 18 now, old enough to understand her duties to her family. Indeed, Helga agreed, and Bjorn is a man of means. A girl could do much worse in a village like this. After Helga left, the tavern fell silent again, except for the wind outside and the settling of the building. Astrid continued her cleaning, moving like one in a dream, while her mother retreated upstairs without another word. But she could feel the weight of Ingrid's gaze and knew that her fate was being decided in the silence. The next morning brought new snow and a stranger to Raven's Hollow. Astrid first noticed him when she stepped outside to draw water from the well. He sat astride a sturdy horse at the edge of the village square, his dark cloak dusted with snow and his eyes scanning the buildings with quiet assessment. There was something about his stillness that drew her attention, not the lazy posture of a man at rest, but the watchful calm of someone accustomed to danger. When their eyes met across the square, she felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, though she was certain she had never seen him before. His face bore the weathered look of a man who spent his time outdoors, with scars that spoke of old battles and eyes the color of winter storms. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair tied back and a beard that couldn't quite hide a mouth that seemed more accustomed to smiling than frowning. He dismounted and approached her with measured steps, leading his horse behind him. As he drew closer, she noticed the quality of his clothing, well made but travel-worn, with subtle details that suggested wealth without displaying it openly. His cloak was fastened with a silver brooch, whose design she didn't recognize, and his sword, though practical, bore the marks of fine craftsmanship. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and carefully modulated. "I'm looking for lodging for a few nights. Would this be the place?" "The Raven's Rest," Astrid confirmed, gesturing toward the tavern. "My mother is the proprietor. I'm sure she can accommodate you." He studied her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "And you are?" "Astrid," she said, then added quickly, "Astrid Eric's daughter." "Eric," he replied with a slight bow of his head. "Eric Grimson." She showed him inside, where her mother quickly appeared to greet their unexpected guest. Ingrid's manner transformed in the presence of a paying customer, becoming almost gracious as she discussed rates and accommodations. Eric agreed to her terms without haggling, producing silver coins with an ease that made Astrid's mother's eyes gleam with interest. Over the following days, Eric became a quiet but constant presence in the tavern. He took his meals downstairs and spent his evenings sitting by the fire, sometimes reading from a small leather-bound book, sometimes simply watching the flames. He was unfailingly polite to both Ingrid and Astrid, but there was something in the way he observed the interactions between mother and daughter that suggested he saw more than most. Astrid found herself stealing glances at him as she went about her work. He never demanded her attention or made inappropriate comments like some of the village men, but she often felt his eyes following her movements. When he did speak to her, It was with a respect she wasn't accustomed to, asking her opinion about the weather or the local customs, listening to her answers as if they mattered. On his third evening in Ravenshollow, as Astrid was banking the fire for the night, he finally broke the careful distance he had maintained. "You seem troubled," he said quietly. Closing his book and setting it aside, Astrid glanced toward the stairs to ensure her mother wasn't within earshot. "It's nothing that concerns you, sir." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But sometimes it helps to speak with someone who has no stake in local affairs." She considered this, weighing the risks of confiding in a stranger against the relief of finally having someone who might listen without judgment. "My mother is arranging a marriage for me," she said finally, "and you object to the match. The man she has chosen is not known for his kindness to women." Eric was quiet for a long moment, his storm-grey eyes studying the dying embers in the fireplace. "What would you choose for yourself if you could?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her what she wanted before. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been given the luxury of choice." "Everyone deserves that luxury," he said firmly. "Even here, even now." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "You speak as one who has had difficult choices to make." "I have," he confirmed, "and I've learned that sometimes the most important choice is deciding who you trust with your future." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Ingrid's footsteps on the stairs. But Astrid found herself thinking about his words long into the night. There had been something in his manner, not pity, but understanding, as if he knew what it meant to feel trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Bjorn Ironhand arrived at the tavern with a proposal that Ingrid received with barely concealed delight. Astrid served them ale while they discussed terms, her hands steady despite the cold fear that had settled in her stomach. The marriage would take place within the month. The bride price was generous enough to solve all of Ingrid's financial troubles. Astrid's fate was sealed with a handshake and a cup of ale, as if she were livestock being sold at market. The announcement came with the evening meal, delivered as casually as commenting on the weather. Ingrid set down a wooden bowl of thin stew before Astrid and said, "Bjorn Ironhand has asked for your hand. I've accepted on your behalf. The wedding will be in 3 weeks' time." Astrid's spoon clattered against the bowl, sending droplets of broth across the rough wooden table. "Mother, you will what?" Ingrid's voice carried the sharp edge that had become her perpetual tone. "Object to a match that will secure both our futures. Bjorn is offering enough silver to repair this tavern and keep us comfortable through the next 5 winters. What more could you want? A husband who won't beat me senseless," Astrid said quietly, her courage surprising even herself. Ingrid's hand struck her cheek with practiced efficiency. "You will not speak such slander about your betrothed. Bjorn is a respected merchant, a man of standing in this community. Any girl would be fortunate to catch his eye." Astrid touched her stinging cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her inner lip. "Any girl would also know what happened to his first 2 wives. Marta died in childbirth, and Sigrid took fever. Such is the lot of women." Ingrid's eyes had gone cold as winter ice. At least they had the comfort of a warm house and a full belly while they lived. "Would you prefer to scrub floors in this tavern until you're old and withered?" The truth of it settled over Astrid like a burial shroud. In Ravenshollow, unmarried women past 20 became objects of pity or suspicion. Without a husband or family to protect them, they depended on charity or degrading work to survive. She had seen such women begging in the streets of larger towns, their faces hollow with hunger and desperation. "The banns will be read this Sunday," Ingrid continued, returning to her meal as if the matter were closed. "Bjorn wants a quiet ceremony, nothing elaborate. The bride price is generous enough that we needn't worry about a dowry." That night, Astrid lay on her narrow bed in the tavern's small back room, staring at the ceiling beams while her mother's words echoed in her mind. Through the thin walls, she could hear Eric moving about in the room above, his footsteps measured and thoughtful. He had been present during the evening meal, though he had said nothing about the announcement. She wondered what he thought of her situation, whether he saw her as just another village girl accepting her inevitable fate. Sleep eluded her until well past midnight, and she woke before dawn with a sense of desperate determination. If she was to be married off like livestock, she would at least know the full extent of her fate. The village women spoke in whispers about Bjorn's wives, but whispers could be exaggeration. She needed to know the truth. Astrid rose early and made her way to the well, knowing that Gudrun, the village's eldest woman, would be among the first to draw water. Gudrun had delivered most of the babies in Ravnshollow and tended the sick and dying. If anyone knew the truth about Bjorn's wives, it would be her. She found the old woman exactly where she expected, her gnarled hands working the rope that lowered the bucket into the well's depths. Gudrun looked up as Astrid approached, her weathered face creasing with sympathy. "I heard the news," Gudrun said without preamble. "Your mother wasted no time spreading word of your good fortune. Was it good fortune for Marta and Sigrid?" Astrid asked directly, Gudrun's hands stilled on the rope. She glanced around to ensure they were alone, then beckoned Astrid closer. Marta died birthing her third stillborn child, but her body bore marks that had nothing to do with childbirth. Bruises on her arms and neck, ribs that had been broken and poorly healed. Astrid felt her stomach turn cold. And Sigrid? Took fever, yes, but only after a fall down the stairs that left her with a cracked skull. Strange how a healthy woman of 25 should become so clumsy in her own home. Gudrun's eyes were hard with old anger. Bjorn wept prettily at both funerals and spoke of how much he missed his beloved wives. The priest spoke of God's will and the weakness of women's bodies. Why does no one speak against him? Because he has silver, and silver buys silence. Because he's clever enough to ensure there are no witnesses to his rages. Because men like Bjorn know how to appear grieved and wronged, while their wives are blamed for their own misfortunes. Gudrun pulled up the bucket and set it aside. Your mother sees only the bride price. She doesn't have to live with the consequences. Astrid walked back to the tavern in a daze, Gudrun's words echoing in her mind. She had suspected the truth, but hearing it confirmed felt like a physical blow. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she would become Bjorn's property, subject to his whims and his fists. The silver he paid would comfort her mother, but it would buy Astrid nothing but suffering. She found Eirik in the tavern's main room, seated at his usual table with his morning meal. He looked up as she entered, and she saw something in his expression that made her think he had been waiting for her. "You look troubled," he said quietly. Astrid glanced toward the stairs, but her mother's movements could be heard in the upper rooms. "May I sit?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course." She settled herself carefully, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. "You said yesterday that everyone deserves the luxury of choice." "I did. What if someone had no choices left? What if every path led to the same destination?" Eirik studied her face with those storm-grey eyes. "There are always choices, though they may not be the ones we would prefer. Sometimes the choice is between different kinds of courage." "I don't understand." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Sometimes courage means staying and enduring. Sometimes it means running toward an unknown future. And sometimes it means accepting help from an unexpected source." Their eyes met across the table, and Astrid felt something pass between them, an understanding that went beyond words. What if the unexpected source were a stranger? Someone with his own mysteries and reasons for offering help? I would say that trust must begin somewhere. And sometimes desperation makes us see clearly what comfort blinds us to. The conversation was interrupted by Ingrid's descent from the upper floor, but not before Eirik had spoken one more sentence, so quietly that Astrid almost missed it. "Meet me by the old oak at midnight if you wish to discuss alternatives to your current situation." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Astrid went through her usual tasks, sweeping, cleaning, serving the few patrons who braved the cold, while her mind churned with possibilities and fears. Eirik had offered her something, though she wasn't certain what. An escape from Bjorn, certainly, but what would he expect in return? She knew little about him beyond his quiet courtesy and the subtle signs of wealth he carried. As the evening wore on and the tavern emptied of customers, Astrid made her decision. Whatever Eirik might propose, it could hardly be worse than marriage to Bjorn Ironhand. When the tavern was finally quiet and her mother had retired to her room, Astrid wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and slipped out into the cold night. The old oak stood at the edge of the village, its massive trunk scarred by lightning but still strong. Eirik was waiting there, a dark figure against the snow-covered ground. As she approached, he turned to face her, and she saw that he carried a rolled parchment in his hands. "You came," he said simply. "I said I would. I have a proposition for you," he said without preamble. "Marriage to me instead of Bjorn. Tonight, before the banns can be read tomorrow." Astrid stared at him in shock. "But you barely know me." "Why would you?" "Because I need a wife, and you need a husband who won't raise his hand to you. Because I see how your mother treats you, and I know what kind of man Bjorn is. Because sometimes practical arrangements grow into something deeper, given time and respect. What would you gain from such a marriage?" Eirik was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Companionship. A partner who understands that survival sometimes requires difficult choices. Someone who won't ask questions about my past or my reasons for staying in remote villages. And what would you expect from me? Honesty, loyalty, nothing you're not freely willing to give." He held up the parchment. "I've already spoken to Father Magnus. He's agreed to perform the ceremony tonight if you consent. The marriage contract is simple. You would take my name and be under my protection. In return, you would be my wife in all ways that matter." Astrid felt her heart racing. It was madness to consider marrying a man she had known for less than a week. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that Bjorn's had never held, respect for her as a person rather than property to be acquired. "If I agree," she said slowly, "there would be no going back. My mother would disown me for ruining her arrangement with Bjorn. You would have a new family," Eirik said gently, "and a future that's yours to shape." Standing in the shadow of the old oak with snow beginning to fall around them, Astrid made the choice that would change everything. She took the parchment from his hands and nodded her consent. Within the hour, she was no longer Astrid Eirik's daughter, but Astrid Grim's daughter, wife to a man whose greatest mystery was his kindness. The wedding ceremony took place in the small stone chapel at the edge of Raven's Hollow, lit only by a handful of candles that cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls. Father Magnus, a man whose discretion had been earned through years of hearing confessions, performed the rites with quiet efficiency. The only witnesses were the carved saints looking down from their niches, their wooden faces seeming to offer blessing or judgment in equal measure. Astrid's hands trembled as she spoke the vows that bound her to this stranger. But Eirik's voice remained steady and sure. When he placed the simple silver ring on her finger, a band engraved with intricate knotwork that spoke of skilled craftsmanship, she felt the weight of her new reality settling around her like his travel-worn cloak. "What's done cannot be undone," Father Magnus said as he blessed their union. "May God grant you wisdom in the path you've chosen." They walked back through the sleeping village in silence, the snow crunching beneath their feet and their breath visible in small clouds in the frigid air. Eirik's cloak, rich wool lined with fur, she noticed now, hung around both their shoulders, offering warmth and an intimacy that felt both foreign and comforting. At the tavern, Eirik paused before the door. "Your mother will discover our marriage in the morning. Tonight, you should rest while you can. Where will you sleep?" Astrid asked, realizing suddenly that everything about their arrangement remained unspoken. "I have my room upstairs. You're welcome to stay in yours until you feel comfortable with other arrangements." His considerate words eased a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. This marriage was born of necessity, not passion. "We have time to become acquainted properly." The next morning brought Ingrid's rage with the force of a winter storm. Astrid woke to the sound of her mother's voice raised in fury, though the words were directed at Eirik rather than her. She dressed quickly and made her way to the main room, where she found her mother pacing like a caged wolf, while Eirik sat calmly at his usual table. breaking his fast as if nothing unusual had occurred. "You had no right," Ingrid was saying, her face flushed with anger. "She was promised to Bjorn Ironhand. Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" "I have some idea," Eric replied mildly, not looking up from his meal. "Perhaps we should discuss compensation for your loss." The offer of money seemed to give Ingrid pause, though her fury didn't abate. "No amount of silver can replace what Bjorn was offering. He'll be here within the hour, expecting to finalize the arrangements. Then you'll have to explain that the bride is no longer available." Eric finally looked up, and there was something in his grey eyes that made even Ingrid step back. "I trust you'll make it clear that any anger over this situation should be directed at me, not at my wife." The casual way he said, "my wife," sent an unexpected warmth through Astrid's chest. She had never heard those words spoken with such quiet possession, devoid of the brutal ownership she had expected from Bjorn. When Bjorn arrived an hour later, his bulk filling the tavern's doorway and his small eyes already bright with anticipated possession, the confrontation was swift and ugly. He took the news of Astrid's marriage with a cold fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "She was promised to me," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Contracts were made. Silver was discussed. No silver changed hands," Eric pointed out, rising from his seat with fluid grace. Astrid noticed for the first time how he moved, like a man accustomed to violence, though he seemed to prefer avoiding it. No legal arrangement was finalized. The girl made her choice. The girl is a child who doesn't know her own mind. Her mother has authority over her marriage. Had authority, Eric corrected. "Now I do." The two men faced each other across the tavern's main room, and Astrid felt the weight of something dangerous hanging in the air. Bjorn was larger and broader, with the thick muscles of a man who had worked with his hands. But there was something about Eric's stillness that suggested he would be far more formidable in any actual conflict. "This isn't over," Bjorn said finally, his gaze shifting to Astrid with a promise that made her blood run cold. "I don't forget when I'm cheated of what's mine." After he left, the tavern felt smaller and somehow safer. Ingrid retreated upstairs with wounded dignity, but not before accepting a small purse of silver from Eirik. Compensation, he said, for the disruption to her plans. It was less than Bjorn would have paid, but enough to ease the immediate sting of lost profit. "He'll cause trouble," Astrid said quietly once they were alone. "Probably," Eric agreed. "Which is why we'll be leaving today." "Leaving?" The word sent a jolt of panic through her. Rubs Hollow was harsh and limiting, but it was the only home she had ever known. "I never intended to stay in one place long. Now I have even more reason to keep moving." He studied her face with those perceptive eyes. "Unless you've changed your mind about your situation here." Astrid thought of Bjorn's parting words, of her mother's cold calculation, of the years of servitude that had been her life until this moment. "No," she said firmly, "I haven't changed my mind." They spent the morning gathering their few possessions. Astrid had little to pack. Her prayer beads, 2 worn dresses, a cloak that had belonged to her father, and a small carved wooden bird he had given her as a child. Everything she owned fit easily into a single travel bag, a stark reminder of how little her previous life had offered. Eric's preparations revealed more about his mysterious nature. His belongings, while not numerous, were of exceptional quality. His sword was perfectly balanced and bore the maker's mark of a renowned weaponsmith. His travel gear was sturdy and well-maintained, suggesting extensive experience on the road. Most intriguingly, he carried a small locked chest that he handled with particular care, though he offered no explanation of its contents. "Where will we go?" Astrid asked as they prepared to leave. "North," Eric said simply. "To my family's lands, and your family will accept me. A tavern girl with no dowry or connections." Eric paused in securing his pack to his horse. "My family values character over bloodlines. They'll see what I see. A woman with courage enough to choose an uncertain future over certain misery," as they mounted. Their horses, Eirik had purchased a gentle mare for Astrid from the village stable. She caught sight of her mother watching from the tavern window. Ingrid's face showed no sorrow at her daughter's departure, only the calculating look of someone reassessing their assets and losses. The village of Ravens Hollow fell away behind them as they rode north along the mountain path. Astrid had never travelled farther than the neighbouring village for market day, and the vast landscape that opened before them filled her with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. "Are you afraid?" Eric asked, as they paused to rest the horses near a frozen stream. Astrid considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted. "But it's a different kind of fear than what I felt before. This fear has hope in it," Eric smiled. This is the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and she realized that perhaps her leap of faith had been wiser than she knew. The mountain path wound upward through pine forests dusted with snow, each bend revealing new vistas of peaks and valleys that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Astrid had never imagined the world could be so vast, so beautiful in its harsh majesty. Riding beside Eric as they climbed higher into the wilderness, she felt simultaneously insignificant and liberated. They had been traveling for 3 days, stopping each night at way stations or sheltered clearings, where Eric demonstrated skills that spoke of extensive travel experience. He could build a fire in minutes, even with damp wood, and seemed to know exactly where to find the most protected spots to camp. More importantly, he maintained a careful distance that respected her uncertainties while offering quiet companionship. On their 4th morning, as they prepared to break camp beside a half-frozen waterfall, Astrid finally found the courage to voice the questions that had been building in her mind. "You're not a common traveler," she said, as she watched him efficiently pack their gear. "Everything about you speaks of education and wealth, yet you were staying in a village tavern like any wandering trader." Eric paused in securing his bedroll, considering his response. "What makes you think that?" "Your sword bears a master weaponsmith's mark. Your horse is bred for both strength and speed. I've seen enough animals come through the village to recognize quality. Your clothes are well made, though you've taken care to make them appear ordinary." She gestured toward his cloak, which she had been sharing during the cold nights. "This wool is finer than anything I've ever touched, and the fur lining comes from Arctic foxes. Even wealthy merchants in Ravens Hollow couldn't afford such things." A smile tugged at the corner of Eric's mouth. "You're very observant. I've spent years watching people, learning to read what they don't say aloud. It was necessary for survival." Astrid met his eyes steadily. "So who are you really, Eric Grimson? And why did you choose to help a tavern girl escape her fate?" Eric was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying the distant peaks as if searching for answers in their snow-covered slopes. "I told you I needed a wife," he said finally. "That was true, though perhaps not in the way you understood it." "What way, then?" "My family has been pressuring me to marry for several years. Political alliances, strategic connections, the usual considerations for someone in my position. I've resisted because I've seen too many marriages built on calculation rather than respect, and I wanted something different." "Your position?" Astrid pressed gently. "My father leads one of the largest clans in the Northern Territories. We control trade routes, maintain alliances with other clans, and settle disputes across a territory larger than most kingdoms. When he dies, that responsibility will fall to me." The words hit Astrid like a physical blow. She had married the heir to a clan chieftain, essentially nobility by northern standards. "And you thought a tavern girl would make a suitable wife for such a position?" "I thought a woman with courage, intelligence, and the strength to endure hardship would make an excellent partner, regardless of her birth." Eric's voice carried quiet conviction. "I've met enough nobles' daughters to know that breeding doesn't guarantee character." They continued their journey in contemplative silence, but Astrid found herself stealing glances at her husband with new understanding. His confident bearing, his unconscious assumption of authority, the way he carried himself, it all made sense now. She had married not just above her station, but so far above it that the concept seemed almost absurd. As if sensing her thoughts, Eric spoke again as they navigated a particularly narrow section of the mountain path. "My mother was born a blacksmith's daughter. She caught my father's eye not because of her family connections, but because she had the courage to argue with him about the proper way to forge a sword blade. They've been married 32 years, and he still asks her opinion on important clan matters. You're trying to reassure me. I'm trying to help you understand that worth isn't determined by birth circumstances. My family values strength, loyalty, and wisdom. You've already demonstrated all three. That evening, they stopped at a way station that was more substantial than the previous night's shelters, a stone building with a proper hearth and sleeping quarters for travelers. The keeper, a grizzled man named Olaf, greeted Eric with obvious recognition and respect that bordered on deference. "Young master," Olaf said, bowing slightly. "We weren't expecting you on this route." "Plans changed," Eric replied simply. "We'll need a room for the night and grain for the horses." Of course, of course." "And the lady?" "My wife," Eric said with quiet pride. "Astrid Grimsdottir." The introduction sent another jolt through Astrid's system. Hearing herself called by her new name, spoken with such certainty, made the reality of her situation more concrete than all their previous conversations combined. Olaf's weathered face broke into a broad grin. "Well, now, that's news worth celebrating. Your parents will be pleased to hear you've finally chosen a bride." As they settled into the way station's main room, sharing a meal of venison stew and dark bread, Astrid noticed how Olaf continued to defer to Eric's judgment on everything from the weather to the condition of the mountain passes. It was clear that word of their marriage would travel ahead of them, announcing to all who knew Eric's true identity that the clan heir had returned with a wife. "Are you beginning to regret your decision?" Eric asked quietly when they were alone by the fire. Astrid considered the question seriously. The magnitude of what she had gotten herself into was overwhelming. She would be expected to take her place as the future leader of a clan, to command respect from people who had been born to wealth and status while she had been born to servitude. The very idea terrified her. But then she remembered Bjorn's cold eyes and her mother's calculating cruelty, and she knew that terror was preferable to despair. "No," she said firmly. "I'm frightened, but I'm not sorry. Whatever challenges await, they're challenges I chose, rather than ones that were forced upon me." "Good," Eric said, and the approval in his voice warmed her more than the fire. "Because tomorrow we reach my family's lands, and I want you to meet them with confidence in your own worth." That night, as she lay on her own sleeping furs near the hearth, while Eric took the small adjoining chamber, Astrid fingered her wooden prayer beads and offered thanks for the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She was still afraid of what the future might hold, but for the first time in her life, she was also excited to discover it. The first glimpse of Valgrimmar lands came at dawn, as they crested a high ridge, and Astrid felt her breath catch in her throat. Spread before them lay a valley unlike anything she had ever imagined, vast and green despite the season, dotted with prosperous farms and crisscrossed by well-maintained roads. At the valley's heart stood a great hall that seemed to rise from the earth itself, its peaked roofs and carved gables speaking of both wealth and ancient tradition. "Welcome home," Eric said softly, and she heard pride and affection mingled in his voice. As they descended into the valley, Astrid began to understand the true scope of Eric's heritage. This wasn't simply a wealthy family, this was a small kingdom. Farmers working in the fields paused to wave at Eric's passing, their faces bright with genuine pleasure at seeing their young lord's return. Children ran alongside their horses for short distances, calling out greetings and questions about his travels. "They love you," Astrid observed, watching a group of youngsters reluctantly fall behind as their horses quickened pace. "They love what I represent," Eric corrected gently. "Security, stability, the promise that their children will inherit something better than what they have now. That's the weight that comes with leadership, being worthy of that trust." The great hall dominated the landscape as they approached, its massive timber frame and stone foundations speaking of generations of careful construction and expansion. Carved dragons' heads adorned the peaked rooflines, their eyes inlaid with precious stones that caught the morning light. The main doors stood open despite the cold, revealing glimpses of warmth and activity within. As they rode into the courtyard, people began emerging from various buildings, servants, craftsmen, warriors, and what were clearly family members based on their fine clothing and confident bearing. At the center of the gathering stood a man who could only be Eric's father, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and the same storm-grey eyes as his son. Eric! The man's voice boomed across the courtyard as he strode forward. About time you returned from your wandering. Your mother was beginning to worry you'd fallen off a mountain somewhere. Father and son embraced with obvious affection, and Astrid felt a pang of envy at the easy warmth between them. She had never known such a relationship with her own parent. "Father, I bring news," Eric said as they separated. "And I hope you'll welcome my wife, Astrid Grimsdottir." The announcement created a moment of perfect silence in the bustling courtyard. Then a woman's voice cut through the quiet with delighted laughter. "Finally! I was beginning to think you were going to remain a bachelor forever." The woman who approached was perhaps 50 years of age, with silver-streaked auburn hair braided with silver wire and intelligent green eyes that assessed Astrid with keen interest rather than judgment. Her clothing was rich but practical, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mother," Eric said with a smile, "may I present Astrid?" "Astrid, this is Ragnhild Valgrimar, lady of this hall and the wisest woman in the Northern Territories." Ragnhild laughed at the introduction. "Flattery will get you nowhere, my son." Though I appreciate the attempt, she turned to Astrid with a warm smile. "Welcome to our family, child. Any woman brave enough to marry this stubborn wanderer deserves our respect and gratitude." The greeting was so different from what Astrid had feared that she found herself momentarily speechless. She had expected suspicion, interrogation about her background, perhaps outright rejection. Instead, she was being welcomed as if her arrival were a gift rather than an inconvenience. "Thank you, my lady," she managed. "I hope I can prove worthy of your kindness." "None of that my lady nonsense," Ragnhild said firmly. "Your family now. Call me mother, as Eric does, or Ragnhild if you prefer. We'll save the formal titles for people we're trying to intimidate." Over the next few hours, Astrid was introduced to what seemed like dozens of family members, clan leaders, and household staff. Each introduction brought fresh challenges as she tried to remember names, relationships, and the subtle hierarchies that governed life in the Great Hall. But to her amazement, everyone seemed genuinely pleased by her presence rather than suspicious of her humble origins. The most significant introduction came when they met Magnus Valgrimar, Eric's father and the clan chief. Unlike his wife's immediate warmth, Magnus studied Astrid with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "So," he said after the formal greetings were complete, "you're the woman who finally convinced my son to settle down. What did you do, save his life?" "Actually," Astrid said, finding her courage, "he saved mine." Magnus's eyebrows rose with interest. "Did he now? Care to elaborate?" Eric had warned her during their journey that his father appreciated directness over diplomatic evasion. So Astrid told the story simply and honestly. Her mother's plan to marry her to Bjorn, her desperate decision to trust a stranger, and Eric's offer of marriage as an escape from certain misery. "Interesting," Magnus mused when she finished. "And what do you bring to this marriage besides gratitude for rescue?" The blunt question might have offended someone of higher birth, but Astrid recognized it as a fair inquiry from a leader concerned about his clan's future. "Honesty," she said simply. "Loyalty to those who earn it. The willingness to work hard and learn whatever I need to learn. And perhaps most importantly, no political connections that might complicate your family's alliances." Magnus was silent for a long moment, then broke into a broad grin. "I like her," he announced to Eric. "She's got backbone and brains, a vast improvement over some of the simpering flowers the other clan chiefs have been trying to foist on you." That evening, the great hall was transformed for a feast celebrating Eric's return and the announcement of his marriage. Long tables were laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, preserved fruits and ale that flowed freely as toast after toast was raised to the new couple. Astrid found herself seated at the high table between Eirik and Ragnhild, a position of honor that still felt surreal. Overwhelmed, Ragnhild asked quietly during a lull in the festivities. Completely, Astrid admitted. This morning I was a tavern girl. Tonight I'm being celebrated as the future lady of a great clan. I'm not sure I know how to be what you need me to be. Good, Ragnhild said firmly. If you weren't overwhelmed, I'd worry you didn't understand the magnitude of what you've taken on. The fact that you're concerned about living up to our expectations tells me you will. As the evening progressed, Astrid began to relax into the warmth and acceptance of her new family. But beneath her growing confidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that this happiness was too perfect, too easily won. In her experience, good fortune was usually followed by hardship, and she found herself wondering what challenges lay ahead in this new life she had stumbled into. 3 weeks into her new life at Valgrimmar, Astrid discovered that acceptance within the family didn't automatically translate to acceptance from everyone in the clan. The challenge came first from Ingeborg, Magnus's younger sister, who had arrived for an extended visit with her 3 daughters, all of marriageable age and all clearly educated to believe they would make suitable wives for clan heirs. She's certainly pretty enough, Ingeborg said during the morning meal, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure Astrid heard every word. Though I suppose tavern work does keep one in good physical condition. The barb was delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Astrid felt the familiar sting of being judged by her origins rather than her character. She had hoped to leave such attitudes behind in Ravenshollow, but it seemed that social snobbery existed even among the wealthy. Ingeborg, Ragnhild's voice cut across the hall with quiet authority. Perhaps you'd like to join me in the weaving room. I have some new patterns I'd like to discuss with you. The invitation was clearly a command, and Ingeborg had no choice but to comply. But the damage was done. Other family members had heard the exchange, and Astrid could see them reassessing her presence with new awareness of the social gulf between her background and theirs. Later that morning, as Astrid worked alongside Ragnhild, learning the complex art of managing a great household, her mother-in-law addressed the incident directly. Ingeborg has always been protective of her daughter's prospects, Ragnhild explained, as they reviewed the household accounts. She had hoped one of them might catch Erik's eye. I can understand her disappointment, Astrid said carefully. Any of her daughters would have brought connections and training that I lack, perhaps. But they also would have brought their mother's sense of entitlement and their grandmother's spite. Ingeborg's mother-in-law made my early years here miserable until Magnus finally told her to choose between accepting me or finding another place to live. The story offered both comfort and warning. Astrid was not the first woman to marry above her station in this family, but that didn't mean the transition would be easy. The real test came 3 days later when Magnus called for a formal clan gathering to discuss trade agreements with neighboring territories. As Erik's wife, Astrid was expected to attend and participate in the discussions, a responsibility she felt wholly unprepared for. I know nothing about trade. Negotiations, she confessed to Erik the night before the meeting. What if I say something foolish and embarrass your family? Then you'll learn from the mistake and do better next time, Erik replied pragmatically. But I think you underestimate yourself. You spent years observing people in your mother's tavern, learning to read motivations and intentions. Those skills are exactly what's needed in negotiations. The clan gathering took place in the Great Hall's formal chamber, a circular room with carved pillars and a raised platform where the clan leaders sat. Representatives from 6 neighboring clans had arrived to discuss everything from marriage alliances to territorial boundaries, and the air hummed with the careful politeness that masked intense competition. Astrid took her place beside Eirik, acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations her presence generated. Many of these people had heard about Magnus's son's unexpected marriage, but this was their first opportunity to assess the woman who would eventually help lead one of the most powerful clans in the region. The negotiations proceeded through the morning without incident, governing grain trade agreements and fishing rights with methodical precision. But the afternoon session brought a more contentious issue, a boundary dispute between the Valgrimar clan and their southeastern neighbors. The Thornburg clan, Jarl Thornburg, a man whose reputation for cunning was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness, presented his case with smooth eloquence. His clan, he argued, had ancient rights to a mountain pass that the Valgrimar clan had been using for trade routes. Recent discoveries of silver deposits in the area had suddenly made those ancient rights much more valuable. Magnus listened patiently to the lengthy recitation of historical claims and legal precedents, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Thornburg finished, the hall fell silent as everyone waited for the clan chief's response. But before Magnus could speak, Astrid found herself rising from her seat. "May I ask a question?" she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. The request was unusual. New clan wives typically observed rather than participated in their first formal gatherings. But Magnus nodded his permission, curious to see what his new daughter-in-law had to say. "Jarl Thornburg," Astrid addressed the southeastern leader directly. "You mention ancient rights to this pass." "How ancient, exactly?" "The rights date back 4 generations," Thornburg replied smoothly. "My great-grandfather established our claim through right of first passage." "I see. And during those 4 generations, how often has your clan actually used this pass for trade?" The question seemed simple enough, but Astrid had noticed something in Thornburg's presentation that others had missed. His elaborate historical justification had focused on legal technicalities rather than practical usage, suggesting that the claim might be more theoretical than real. Thornburg's pause before answering confirmed her suspicion. "We have used it when necessary, but not regularly. The terrain is challenging. We found other routes more convenient for most purposes. Until now," Astrid said quietly, "until silver was discovered in the area." A murmur of understanding rippled through the gathering. By forcing Thornburg to admit that his clan had not been actively using the disputed territory, Astrid had undermined the foundation of his claim. Ancient rights that were never exercised were far weaker than active usage and maintenance of trade routes. Magnus took control of the discussion from there, building on Astrid's insight to present a compelling case for Valgrimar's continued control of the pass. The matter was settled with minimal concessions, far better than might have been achieved through Thornburg's original aggressive demands. As the gathering concluded and the various clan representatives prepared to depart, Astrid found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations on her perceptive questions. Even Ingeborg approached with grudging respect. "That was well done," she admitted. "Perhaps Eric chose more wisely than I initially thought." But it was Magnus's approval that meant the most to Astrid. As the hall emptied, the clan chief approached her with a satisfied smile. "You have good instincts for seeing through political maneuvering," he said. "That's a valuable skill for someone in your position. Where did you learn to ask such pointed questions?" "Years of serving ale to men who thought a tavern girl was too stupid to understand their conversations," Astrid replied honestly. "I learned that people often reveal more than they intend when they think no one important is listening." Magnus laughed, a rich, pleased sound. "I think you're going to fit in here very well indeed." That evening, as she and Eric retired to their private chambers, they had finally begun sharing a room after weeks of careful courtship. Astrid reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled her mother's tavern in desperation. She was becoming someone new, someone worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. But even as she embraced her growing confidence, a part of her wondered what new challenges this transformation might bring. The messenger arrived on a grey morning, 6 weeks after Astrid's successful intervention in the clan gathering. His horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. He bore the colours of Ravenshollow, though his urgent manner suggested news far more serious than typical village affairs. Magnus received him in the great hall, while the family broke their fast, and Astrid felt her stomach clench with foreboding as she recognized the man as one of the traders who occasionally frequented her mother's tavern. "What news from the south, Kettle?" Magnus asked, offering the messenger ale and bread. "Dark tidings, my lord," Kettle replied, his weathered face grim. "Bjorn Ironhand is dead, murdered in his own home 3 nights past. But that's not the worst of it." A chill ran down Astrid's spine. She had hoped never to hear Bjorn's name again. But his death brought no relief, only a sense of impending doom. "Continue," Magnus commanded. "The man died with Astrid Eriksdottir's name on his lips, my lord. He was found in his bedchamber with his throat cut and a message carved into the wall above his bed. Payment for stolen goods. Your son's wife has been accused of arranging his murder." The accusation hit the hall like a thunderclap. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to Astrid, who sat frozen in her chair as the implications crashed over her. Someone had killed Bjorn and deliberately implicated her in the crime. "That's impossible," Eric said immediately, rising from his seat. "My wife has been here for weeks. She couldn't have arranged anything in Ravenshollow." "Perhaps not directly," Kettle continued reluctantly. "But Ingrid Eriksdottir claims her daughter threatened Bjorn before she fled the village. She says Astrid swore he would pay for trying to force her into marriage. The local magistrate has issued a warrant for questioning." "My mother said that?" Astrid found her voice at last, though it sounded hollow to her own ears. "She accused me of murder." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Ingrid had never shown maternal affection, but to actively work against her own daughter suggested a malice that Astrid had never fully comprehended. Magnus studied the messenger intently. "Who benefits from Bjorn's death?" "His nephew Ragnar inherits everything. The man's been deep in debt to Bjorn for years, and now suddenly he's one of the wealthiest men in the region." "And who brought these accusations against my daughter-in-law?" "Ragnar himself, my lord. He claims to be seeking justice for his uncle's murder." The pattern was becoming clear, and Astrid felt sick as she understood how expertly she had been manipulated. Ragnar had killed his uncle, carved the message to implicate her, and convinced her mother to support the accusation. Ingrid's cooperation wouldn't have been difficult to secure. She was probably being compensated for her testimony. "This is obviously a fabrication," Ragnhild said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see what's happening here." "Of course it is," Magnus agreed. "But proving that will require more than our certainty of Astrid's innocence. These accusations threaten not just her, but our entire clan's reputation." As the family discussed the implications and possible responses, Astrid found herself remembering a conversation from weeks earlier. Gettil had finished his official message, but he lingered near her chair with the look of a man carrying additional burden. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked quietly. Kettil glanced around to ensure no one else was listening, then leaned closer. "Your mother, lady. She's been seen wearing new clothes, expensive jewelry. Ragnar's been very generous to those who support his version of events." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Her mother hadn't just been convinced to lie, she had been purchased. Ingrid's testimony wasn't born of misguided belief in her daughter's guilt, but of calculated greed. The woman who had birthed her and raised her had sold her to murderers for silver. "Thank you for telling me," Astrid managed. "For what it's worth," Kettle said softly, "not everyone in Ravenshollow believes the accusations. Gudrun the healer has been asking pointed questions about the timing of Ragnar's sudden solvency. But she's just an old woman, and her voice carries little weight against silver." That afternoon, Magnus convened a war council in his private chambers. The core family members attended: Eirik, Ragnhild, Magnus himself, and 2 of his most trusted advisors. They discussed the legal and political ramifications of the accusations, while Astrid sat silent, still reeling from the magnitude of the betrayal. "We could simply refuse to honor the warrant," suggested Harold, Magnus's battle-scarred war chief. "Ravenshollow has no authority here, and we have the strength to resist any attempt at enforcement." "That would make us appear guilty," Ragnhild pointed out. And it would give Ragnar exactly what he wants, a reason to claim we're harboring a murderer. Then we send evidence of Ragnar's guilt to the magistrate, Eric proposed. Surely the timing of his debt relief and sudden accusations is suspicious enough to warrant investigation. Evidence we don't yet possess, Magnus said pragmatically. And obtaining it would require sending people into hostile territory, where Ragnar now holds significant influence. As the discussion continued, Astrid realized that she was not just the victim of this conspiracy, she was also the key to resolving it. The accusation had been carefully crafted to divide her from her new family and weaken the Valgrimmar clan's position. But the conspirators had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated both her intelligence and her new family's loyalty. "I know how to prove my innocence," she said suddenly, interrupting a debate about legal precedents. All eyes turned to her. "How?" Magnus asked. "By returning to Ravenshollow and exposing the truth," Astrid said, her voice growing stronger as the plan formed in her mind. "Ragnar's scheme depends on keeping me away, so I can't defend myself. He's counting on my fear and my family's protectiveness to keep me safely distant while he consolidates his story." "Absolutely not," Eric said immediately. "It's too dangerous. If Ragnar is willing to commit murder, he won't hesitate to ensure you never return to contradict his accusations. He won't dare harm me if I arrive publicly with witnesses," Astrid countered. "And he can't maintain his lies if I'm there to point out their inconsistencies. The people of Ravenshollow knew Bjorn, knew me, knew my mother. They'll recognize the truth if it's presented properly." Magnus studied her intently. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I return to Ravenshollow openly, with an escort that demonstrates my confidence in my innocence. I demand a public hearing where I can confront my accusers and present evidence of Ragnar's motives. And most importantly, I force my mother to look me in the eye while she repeats her lies." "That last part might be the most effective," Ragnhild observed thoughtfully. "Ingrid may be greedy, but she's not stupid. Faced with public scrutiny and her daughter's direct questions, she might find her purchased testimony harder to maintain. Or she might double down on her accusations," Harold warned. "Greed can make people surprisingly stubborn. Then we expose her greed," Astrid said simply. "Show everyone her new clothes and jewelry. Ask how a tavern keeper's widow suddenly acquired such wealth. Make it clear that her testimony has been bought and paid for." The plan was audacious and risky, but as they discussed the details, it began to take shape. Astrid would return to Ravenshollow with a small but impressive escort, demanding not just a hearing, but a full investigation into Bjorn's death. She would use her knowledge of village politics and personalities to expose the inconsistencies in Ragnar's story while demonstrating the clan's confidence in her innocence. "If we do this," Magnus said finally, "there's no retreat. If the plan fails, if Ragnar manages to turn the situation against us, the consequences could be severe for our entire clan." "The consequences of doing nothing could be worse," Astrid replied. "This accusation will follow me forever unless it's definitively disproven. And it gives our enemies a weapon to use against us. They can always claim we harbor criminals." Eric took her hand, his storm-grey eyes reflecting both pride and concern. "Are you certain you want to face this? We could weather the political damage, find other ways to clear your name." "I'm certain," Astrid said firmly. "I've spent my entire life running from conflicts I didn't create. This time I'm going to stand and fight." As night fell over Valgrimmar, preparations began for a journey that would either vindicate Astrid completely or destroy everything she had built in her new life. But for the first time since the accusations had been made, she felt a spark of hope. She was no longer the frightened tavern girl who had fled Ravenshollow in desperation. She was Astrid Grimsdottir, wife to a clan heir and daughter to one of the most powerful families in the north. And she was going home to reclaim her honor. The preparations for their return to Ravenshollow took 3 days, and every detail was planned with the precision of a military campaign. Magnus insisted on sending a full escort of 12 warriors, men whose presence would demonstrate both the clan's power and their absolute confidence in Astrid's innocence. Their armor was polished to mirror brightness, their weapons sharp and ready, and their bearing spoke of disciplined strength. "Remember," Magnus instructed as they gathered in the courtyard for departure, "you're not going as supplicants begging for justice. You're going as representatives of the Valgrimmar clan, demanding satisfaction for false accusations against one of our own." Astrid wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool with silver embroidery at the cuffs and collar, fine enough to demonstrate her elevated status, practical enough for the journey ahead. Around her neck hung a silver chain bearing the Valgrimmar clan emblem, a gift from Ragnhild that served both as jewelry and as a clear declaration of family allegiance. Eric had wanted to lead the escort himself, but Magnus had overruled him with sound tactical reasoning. The clan heir's presence might be seen as provocative, while a formal escort, led by Harald the war chief, would demonstrate appropriate respect for legal procedures while making their strength unmistakably clear. "I should be going with you," Eric said for the third time as they prepared to mount their horses. "You should be here, making sure our political alliances remain solid while we deal with this crisis," Astrid replied, though she shared his reluctance to be separated. "Your father is right. This needs to look like confidence in legal justice, not preparation for war. Send word immediately if anything goes wrong," he insisted, taking her hands in his. "I can have 50 men riding south within hours of receiving your signal." "It won't come to that," she said with more certainty than she felt. "Ragnar's scheme depends on subtlety and legal manipulation. Open violence would expose him for what he is." As their party rode out of Valgrimmar, Astrid carried with her more than just the clan's support. She carried evidence. Magnus's advisors had spent 2 days gathering information about Ragnar's financial situation, his relationship with his uncle, and the convenient timing of several other deaths that had brought him increased wealth and influence. They had also prepared detailed documentation of Astrid's whereabouts during the time of Bjorn's murder, witnessed statements from dozens of clan members who could attest to her presence at Valgrimmar. The journey south took 4 days, and with each mile they covered, Astrid felt the weight of returning to her past. The landscape grew more familiar, more confining, as the broad valleys of Valgrimmar territory gave way to the narrow mountain passes and harsh terrain of her childhood. By the time they crested the final ridge before Ravenshollow, she could see the village spread below them like a collection of toys, smaller and more pathetic than her memories had painted it. "Second thoughts?" Harald asked, noting her expression. "No," Astrid said firmly, "just remembering how small my world used to be." They made their entrance at midday, when the village square would be busiest with market activity. The sight of 12 armored warriors escorting a richly dressed woman caused immediate commotion. Villagers stopped their business to stare. Children ran alongside their horses, and Astrid could see whispered conversations spreading like ripples through the crowd. The Raven's Rest looked shabbier than she remembered, its wooden walls weathered, and its roof sagging in places that spoke of continued neglect. But smoke rose from its chimney, and she could see figures moving about inside. Her mother's business continued, despite the dramatic changes in their family circumstances. Ragnar was waiting for them, as she had expected he would be. Word of their approach would have reached him long before they entered the village proper. He stood in front of the tavern with several other men, his posture attempting confidence, but his eyes betraying nervousness at the impressive escort that accompanied the woman he had accused of murder. "Astrid Eriksdottir," he called out, using her maiden name deliberately. "You've returned to face justice at last." "Astrid Grimsdottir," she corrected firmly, dismounting with graceful dignity. "Wife to Eric Valgrimmar and daughter to Magnus of the Northern clans. I've come to answer false accusations and see justice done for the innocent." The declaration sent another ripple through the growing crowd. Many of these people had known her as the quiet tavern girl who served ale and cleaned tables. Seeing her now, dressed in fine clothes and escorted by warriors, challenged their understanding of who she had been and who she had become. False accusations? Ragnar's voice rose with practiced indignation. My uncle lies dead, murdered by the very woman he had planned to marry. She threatened him publicly before fleeing the village like a guilty thing. I fled an arranged marriage to a man known for beating his wives to death, Astrid replied, her voice carrying clearly across the square. A fact that seems relevant given your uncle's current condition. Harald stepped forward, his scarred face impassive, but his hand resting meaningfully on his sword hilt. Ragnar Bjornsson, you stand accused of murdering your uncle for inheritance and attempting to blame the innocent for your crime. The Valgrimmar clan demands formal investigation of these charges. I stand accused. Ragnar sputtered. I'm the one seeking justice for my murdered kinsman. Justice that conveniently places you in control of his wealth and property, Astrid observed. Tell me, Ragnar, how did you manage to pay off your debts so quickly after your uncle's death? Particularly the debt you owed to Bjorn himself. The question hit its mark. Ragnar's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. She threatened him. I heard her with my own ears. Ingrid emerged from the tavern, and Astrid felt her heart clench at the sight of her mother. As Ketil had reported, Ingrid wore new clothes, a dress of fine brown wool with a fur-trimmed cloak that would have cost more than the tavern earned in a season. Silver bracelets adorned her wrists, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style more suitable for a wealthy merchant's wife than a village tavern keeper. Mother, Astrid said quietly, and the single word carried more pain than any accusation. Don't you mother me, Ingrid snapped. Though her eyes wouldn't quite meet Astrid's. You made your choice when you ran off with that stranger. You chose your new family over your duty to the one that raised you. I chose not to be beaten to death by Bjorn Ironhand, Astrid replied. The same fate that befell Marta and Sigrid, in case you've forgotten. Those were accidents, Ragnar interjected quickly. Tragedies, but not murder. Were they? Astrid turned to address the crowd that had gathered. Gudrun, you tended both women. Were their injuries consistent with accidents? The old healer pushed through the crowd, her weathered face set in grim lines. No, she said clearly. They were not. And I said so at the time, though none would listen to the word of an old woman against a man with silver to distribute. This is irrelevant, Ragnar protested. We're here to discuss Bjorn's murder, not ancient history. Ancient history that establishes a pattern, Harald observed. 3 dead wives, a nephew deep in debt, and convenient accusations against a woman who was 50 miles away when the crime occurred. Distance means nothing when conspiracy is involved, Ingrid said, though her voice lacked conviction. She could have hired killers, sent instructions. With what money? Astrid asked her mother directly. I left here with nothing but the clothes I wore. I had no silver to hire killers, no connections to arrange murders. What I had was a new family who accepted me as I was, not as a commodity to be sold. For the first time, Ingrid's eyes met her daughter's, and Astrid saw something flicker there, doubt perhaps, or guilt. But before her mother could respond, Ragnar stepped between them. Enough of this, he declared. The magistrate has issued a warrant based on clear evidence of threat and motive. She must answer for her crimes in a proper court, not in this mob gathering. Agreed, Harald said smoothly. We demand immediate trial before the local assembly, with full presentation of evidence from both sides. Let the people of Ravenshollow hear all the facts and judge accordingly. The proposal was standard legal procedure, but Astrid could see it wasn't what Ragnar had wanted. He had hoped to have her arrested quietly, spirited away to face charges where her new family's influence couldn't protect her. A public trial would force him to present his evidence openly, subject to questioning and contradiction. Very well, Ragnar agreed reluctantly. But the trial will proceed according to law. She'll be held until the assembly can convene. She'll be held under the protection of her escort, Harald corrected firmly. The Valgrimmar clan guarantees her appearance, and our honor stands surety for her conduct. As the crowd began to disperse to prepare for the trial that would take place the next morning, Astrid found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since their arrival. The confrontation had gone well, better than she had dared hope. Ragnar's nervousness was obvious. Her mother's guilt was beginning to show, and the villagers were clearly questioning the accusations that had seemed so certain from a distance. But tomorrow would bring the real test. She would have to stand before the people who had known her all her life and convince them that the quiet tavern girl they remembered had become someone worthy of truth and justice. More than that, she would have to expose the conspiracy that had murdered Bjorn and attempted to destroy her new life. As she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, Astrid touched the silver chain at her throat and drew strength from the symbol it bore. She was no longer alone, no longer powerless. Tomorrow, she would prove that some people could not be bought, some truths could not be buried, and some accusations could not stand against courage and determination. The girl who had fled Ravenshollow in desperation was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to fight for her honor and her future. The village assembly, convened at dawn in the largest building Ravenshollow, possessed the grain hall where the community stored their harvest and held their most important gatherings. The space had been arranged with benches for the villagers and a raised platform where the accused, accusers, and witnesses would present their cases. Thorstein the Elder, Ravenshollow's magistrate, presided from a carved chair that had served the village's legal proceedings for 3 generations. Astrid entered the hall, flanked by 2 of Harald's men, their presence both protective and symbolic. She wore the same blue dress from the previous day, but had added a silver circlet that Ragnhild had given her, a subtle crown that marked her status as clan nobility. The villagers who packed the benches watched her with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and dawning recognition that the woman before them was no longer the girl they had known. Ragnar sat on the opposite side of the hall with his supporters, men who had benefited from his uncle's death or who owed him money. Ingrid sat among them, though her posture suggested discomfort rather than confidence. The elaborate jewelry she wore seemed to weigh heavily on her, and she avoided looking directly at her daughter. "We are gathered," Thorstein announced in his creaky voice, "to hear accusations of murder brought against Astrid, daughter of Eric, lately wife to Eric of the Valgrimmar clan. Let the accusers present their evidence." Ragnar rose with theatrical gravity, his movements calculated to project righteous grief. "Honored assembly, my beloved uncle Bjorn Ironhand was brutally murdered in his own home, his throat cut while he slept. The killer left a message carved into the wall. Payment for stolen goods. This woman," he pointed dramatically at Astrid, "publicly threatened my uncle before fleeing the village like a guilty thing. She had motive, means, and opportunity." "What motive?" Thorstein asked. "My uncle had arranged to marry her, offering a generous bride price to her mother. But she refused the match and swore he would pay for forcing her into marriage." Multiple witnesses heard these threats. Ingrid stood reluctantly when called upon, her testimony delivered in a voice that lacked conviction. "My daughter was always willful," she said, not meeting Astrid's eyes. "When I told her of the marriage arrangement, she became enraged. She said Bjorn would regret trying to own her, that he would pay for treating women like property." "And did you understand these words as threats?" Ragnar prompted. I thought she was just angry. But after what happened," Ingrid's voice trailed off. "What of means and opportunity?" Thorstein asked. "She fled the village with a stranger, a man who could have returned to carry out her revenge. Or she could have hired killers with the wealth her new marriage brought her." The accusations hung in the air like poison, and Astrid could see their effect on some of the villagers. The case sounded plausible to those who didn't know the full truth, and Ragnar's presentation had been smooth and convincing. When her turn came, Astrid stood with quiet dignity, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Honored assembly, I stand before you falsely accused by a man who murdered his own uncle for inheritance. I will prove this to you with facts, not theatrics," she began methodically. presenting documentation of her whereabouts on the night of Bjorn's murder, sworn statements from dozens of clan members, records of her participation in household duties, witnesses to her presence at meals and gatherings. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to fabricate. As you can see, I was 50 miles away when Bjorn died, surrounded by witnesses who can attest to my presence. I had no opportunity to commit this crime, nor any means to arrange it from such distance. But what of motive? Ragnar interjected. You admit you refused the marriage, that you threatened my uncle. I refused a marriage that would have meant my death, Astrid replied firmly. Bjorn's first two wives died under suspicious circumstances, a fact well known to everyone in this room. I threatened no one. I simply chose life over certain destruction. She turned to address the assembly directly. But let us examine who truly had motive for Bjorn's death. Ragnar here was deeply in debt to his uncle, a debt that would have ruined him. With Bjorn's death, that debt disappears, and Ragnar inherits everything. Look at his sudden wealth, his new clothes, his ability to distribute silver to those who support his accusations. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people began to consider this alternative explanation. Astrid pressed her advantage. And consider the timing. Why would I wait weeks after my marriage to arrange revenge? Why leave such an obvious message that would point to me? The answer is simple: I wouldn't. But someone wanting to deflect suspicion from himself might find it very convenient to blame a woman who had already left the village. This is pure speculation. Ragnar protested, but his voice carried less authority than before. Is it? Astrid asked. Then let us hear from other witnesses. Gudrun, tell the assembly about Bjorn's treatment of his wives. The old healer stood, her voice clear and steady despite her age. Bjorn Ironhand was a cruel man who beat women to death and called it accident. Marta and Sigrid both died of injuries that had nothing to do with childbirth or fever. I said so at the time, but silver speaks louder than truth in this village. The testimony sent a shock through the assembly. Many had suspected the truth about Bjorn's wives, but hearing it stated so bluntly forced them to confront what they had chosen to ignore. The atmosphere in the grain hall shifted palpably after Gudrun's testimony. Whispered conversations erupted among the villagers as they absorbed the implications of what they had just heard. Ragnar's confident demeanor began to crack, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. These are old accusations against a dead man who cannot defend himself, Ragnar said desperately. We're here to discuss his murder, not unfounded rumors about his marriages. Unfounded? Astrid's voice cut through his protests. Then let's discuss facts that can be verified. Dorstein, I call upon you to examine Ragnar's financial records. Compare his debts from 6 months ago to his current wealth. Ask him to explain how a man who couldn't afford grain for his family suddenly has silver enough to buy my mother's testimony. The magistrate's weathered face showed growing interest. Ragnar Bjornsson, the assembly has the right to examine evidence relevant to these proceedings. Will you provide documentation of your financial situation? My affairs are private, Ragnar stammered. A man's business dealings are not subject to public scrutiny without cause. Murder accusations provide ample cause, Torstein replied firmly. And your reluctance suggests you have something to hide. Harold stepped forward with a leather satchel. Honored magistrate, we have obtained copies of debt records from several merchants in the region. They show that Ragnar owed his uncle a sum that would have bankrupted him, a debt mysteriously forgiven immediately after Bjorn's death. As Harold spread the documents on the magistrate's table, the mathematical truth became undeniable. Ragnar had been facing financial ruin before his uncle's death and sudden prosperity afterward. The timing was too convenient to ignore. Furthermore, Astrid continued, pressing her advantage, let's examine the supposed evidence of my threats. Mother, stand and tell this assembly exactly what I said to you about Bjorn. Ingrid rose reluctantly, her face pale beneath the rouge she had applied. You said he was a cruel man who hurt women, and that you wouldn't marry him because you valued your life. Did I threaten to kill him? Not exactly. Did I say I would arrange his death? No. Ingrid whispered. Then what did I actually threaten? The silence stretched unbearably before Ingrid answered. You said you would rather run away than become his wife. The admission destroyed the foundation of Ragnar's case. Astrid's supposed threats were revealed as nothing more than a young woman's desperate declaration that she would not accept abuse. So my actual words were that I would leave rather than marry a violent man, Astrid summarized, which is exactly what I did. I left, legally married another man, and began a new life. Where exactly is the threat in that? Ragnar's support was visibly crumbling. Several of his allies shifted uncomfortably, and Astrid could see doubt spreading through the assembly like ripples in a pond. But the message carved at the murder scene, Ragnar said desperately. Payment for stolen goods, that clearly refers to her anger about the marriage arrangement. Does it? Astrid asked. Or does it refer to something else entirely? Tell me, Ragnar, what goods did Bjorn steal from others during his lifetime? What debts did he collect through violence and intimidation? What property did he claim through the convenient deaths of those who opposed him? The questions hit their mark. Bjorn's reputation for ruthless business practices was well known, and several villagers nodded as they considered alternative interpretations of the carved message. You're grasping at shadows, Ragnar protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Then explain this. Astrid produced a small object from her pouch, a silver pin that Harald's men had discovered near Bjorn's house. This pin bears your family's mark, Ragnar. It was found hidden near your uncle's window, as if someone had dropped it while climbing through. The pin gleamed in the torchlight, its distinctive design unmistakable to everyone present. Ragnar's face went white as he stared at the evidence of his presence at the murder scene. That could have been dropped at any time, he said weakly. Could it? Or was it torn from your cloak as you climbed through your uncle's window to cut his throat while he slept? The accusation rang through the hall with the force of absolute certainty. Ragnar's guilt was written across his face as clearly as if he had confessed aloud. You killed him, Astrid continued relentlessly. You murdered your own uncle for his wealth, then tried to blame me because I was a convenient target. You thought a simple tavern girl would have no way to defend herself, no family to support her claims of innocence. No, Ragnar said desperately. No, that's not... I didn't... But you were wrong. Astrid's voice rose with quiet triumph. I'm no longer a powerless girl. I'm Astrid Grimsdottir, daughter to the Valgrimmar clan, and I will not be blamed for your crimes. The grain hall erupted in chaos as Ragnar's remaining supporters abandoned him and the villagers voiced their outrage at the deception. Thorstein called for order, but the truth had been revealed and could not be contained. In the space of an hour, Astrid had transformed from accused murderer to wronged victim, while Ragnar's careful conspiracy crumbled into ruins around him. The formal judgment came swiftly once the evidence had been presented. Thorstein the Elder consulted briefly with the village council before pronouncing Ragnar guilty of murder and conspiracy. The man who had schemed to destroy Astrid's life was led away in chains, his wealth confiscated to compensate Bjorn's true heirs and the families he had deceived. The justice was harsh but fair, witnessed by an assembly that had seen truth triumph over carefully crafted lies. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with discussion of the dramatic revelations, Astrid found herself standing alone with her mother in the grain hall. Ingrid's fine clothes seemed tawdry now, her jewelry a visible reminder of her willingness to sell her daughter's honor for silver. Why? Astrid asked quietly. I understand that you never loved me as a mother should, but why actively work to destroy me? Ingrid's face crumpled, years of bitterness and regret finally showing through the mask of cold calculation she had worn for so long. Because I was jealous, she whispered. Because you found a way out of this place, found someone who valued you, while I remained trapped in that failing tavern with nothing but memories of what I used to be. The honesty was more painful than hatred would have been. You could have asked for help. My new family would have assisted you. I was too proud to beg, Ingrid said, then looked directly at her daughter for the first time in months. And too ashamed to admit that I had been wrong about everything, about Bjorn, about your marriage, about what kind of person you had become. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of lost years and broken trust heavy between them. Finally, Astrid reached into her purse and withdrew a small leather pouch heavy with silver. "This is enough to repair your tavern and keep you comfortable for several years," she said, placing it on the table between them. "Consider it payment for the woman who gave me life, if not love." Ingrid stared at the pouch as if it might disappear. "I don't deserve your kindness." "No," Astrid agreed simply. "But I deserve to know that I acted with honor, regardless of how others have treated me." As she turned to leave, Ingrid's voice stopped her. "Astrid, I am proud of what you've become. I should have said that long ago." "Yes," Astrid replied without turning back. "You should have." The journey back to Valgrimmar took 4 days, but it felt like traveling through a different world than the one they had left. News of Astrid's vindication had spread ahead of them, carried by traders and travelers who had witnessed the trial. At each way station and village, they were greeted with respect and curiosity about the woman who had outsmarted a murderer and exposed a conspiracy. Harold rode beside her on the final day, his scarred face thoughtful. "You handled yourself well back there," he said. "Better than many warriors I've seen in battle." "It was a different kind of fighting," Astrid replied. "But fighting nonetheless, the hardest kind sometimes. When swords are drawn, everyone knows where they stand. In courtrooms and council chambers, the weapons are words, and the wounds are harder to see." As they crested the familiar ridge that looked down into Valgrimmar Valley, Astrid felt a profound sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography. This was where she belonged now, not because she had been born here, but because she had chosen it and proven herself worthy of it. The great hall erupted in celebration when their party arrived. Eric swept her into his arms with relief and pride shining in his storm-grey eyes, while Magnus and Ragnhild embraced her as the vindicated daughter she had become. Even Ingeborg, who had once questioned her worthiness, offered genuine congratulations on her triumph. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their private chambers, Eric listened to her detailed account of the trial with growing admiration. "You could have stayed here and let others fight this battle for you," he said when she finished. "Why was it so important to face it yourself?" "Because I needed to know I could," Astrid replied honestly. "For most of my life, I believed I was powerless, that my fate was always in someone else's hands. Going back to Raven's Hollow, standing up to Ragnar and my mother, proving my own innocence, it showed me that I'm not the same person who fled that village in desperation. And who are you now?" Astrid considered the question, fingering the prayer beads she still wore, the one possession that had traveled with her from her old life to her new one. But their meaning had changed. Where once they had represented desperate pleas for rescue, now they reminded her of the strength that had always been inside her, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "I'm someone who chooses her own path," she said finally. "Someone who stands up for what's right even when it's difficult. Someone worthy of the trust you and your family have placed in me." Eric smiled and pulled her closer. "You always were that person. You just needed the chance to prove it to yourself." As winter settled over Valgrimmar lands and the great hall prepared for the long, cozy months ahead, Astrid found herself looking forward rather than back for the first time in her life. There would be challenges ahead. There always were, for those in positions of leadership. But she faced them now with confidence in her own abilities and the support of a family that valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The frightened girl who had once scrubbed floors in a failing tavern was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and was prepared to defend it. Sometimes the greatest journeys were not measured in miles traveled, but in the distance between who you were and who you chose to become. In the flickering firelight of her new home, surrounded by love and respect she had earned through courage and determination, Astrid Grimsdottir smiled and planned for a future that was entirely her own creation.